Dr. Bophy is present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Davis is present. Ms. Edmiston?
Present.
Ms. Edmiston is present. Mr. Garvey?
Here.
Mr. Garvey is present. Ms. Holloway? Ms. Holloway is present. Dr. Jones? Dr. Jones is present. Ms. Lewis? Ms. Lewis is not present. Ms. Orange Jones? Ms. Orange Jones is not present. Mr. Rock? Mr. Rock is not present. Dr. Thomason?
Present.
Dr. Thomason is present. Ms. Fortier?
Here.
Ms. Fortier is present. We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Before we get started, I'll take a point of privilege just to recognize we have Senator Beth Mizell with us. Senator, thank you for being with us today. She's busy. Thank you for being with us, Senator Beth Mizell. Thank you. Our first item.
Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding item 3.1.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Any objection? Any discussion? No objection. Motion carries. Next item.
On page 24, item 3.2, consideration of 8G funding cycle activities, approval of fiscal year 2017-2018 allocations for individual 8G statewide programs. Recommendation is to approve.
Do I have a motion from the board?
So moved.
Dr. Thomason, second. Ms. Holloway, any discussion? Any questions from the board? No discussion, no questions, any objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 27, item 3.3, consideration of 8G funding cycle activities, approval of 8G statewide programs for fiscal year 2017-2018. The recommendation is to approve.
Can I have a motion, please? Dr. Bophy, need a second. Ms. Evanston, any questions from the board? With no questions from the board, do I have any objections to the motion? With no objections, motion carries. Next item, please.
On
Mr.
page
Chairman,
42.
Can I interrupt for a second? I'm looking for an agenda item, and I can't find it. I thought we had an item in this packet that talked about money being allocated to families, helping families. Does that ring a bell?
No, there is no agenda item related to that at this meeting.
I thought there was something that I read recently about us switching from, or switching to an RFA, Q, whatever it is, for families, helping families applying for funding. But that's not in this, Bessie, this
No.
meeting this month?
No.
When is that coming to Bessie?
If there are contracts in August, is that August at the next meeting?
So those items are not in this agenda for today.
Okay. There are some people that would like to talk about that issue. Is there
That
any
issue's not
item
today.
today that can be discussed under, or
It's not
Would
on
it
here,
be
Superintendent. Is there anything close to that?
more
that you
proper for them to come back in August?
I think it would be more proper at that time. There is really not anything that's germane on this agenda item.
And there's definitely nothing that we will be deciding today that will affect that item
absolutely
and
not.
negatively affect what
No,
they're
sir.
trying to achieve.
No,
Okay,
sir.
thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. Mrs. O'Shea, question?
I don't know if it's appropriate, but in a clarifying, I guess, situation here, I had a similar question because I've had questions about this. It's my understanding that that's part of the IDEA set-aside. Did we approve at a prior meeting something about the set-aside and going out for an RFA as opposed to, I guess that would be Mr. Garvey's question. Did we approve something prior to that with the set-aside, or is that even something that would come before us?
Once there are completed procurement processes, yes. But as you have requested on numerous occasions, the Special Education Advisory Panel approved an IDEA set of budget categories after an extremely lengthy process of public engagement. In light of those categories, the department issued specific requests for proposals. Those requests for proposals are under a competitive process. Families Helping Families and any one of a number of dozens of organizations that are eligible to participate in those procurements have been advised of their ability to participate in that process. I do believe that I have seen correspondence in the last couple of days on email that has been urging people to attend this meeting, but I have not understood myself what item was germane to this. And in fact, even the emails that I have seen going around have acknowledged the fact that there is no germane item on this particular agenda related to this issue.
Okay, so just for my own clarity, Bessie, you're saying that the Special Education Advisory Committee determines the allocations in the overall allocations in the set-aside. That has not come before Bessie, and that's not what we would normally do. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
So this is a function of the advisory committee determining how much money will go into certain set-aside categories and then issue the recommendation to the department to issue the RFA based on those categories.
That's correct. I want to make sure that, I don't know that every bit of that language, Jamie, is exactly accurate, so why don't you come down and just make sure that we're totally copacetic. Let me just recap what it is that we're discussing here in light of the emails that have been sent around. There is roughly $20 million of IDEA funding that every year the federal government says to states, you are to dedicate this to statewide programs. For years, Mr. Fleming and others have come to the table saying, I don't know how this money is spent or who has determined it. So we convened a subgroup of Bessie members to outline how it is spent. And then at the suggestion of Bessie members, determined that it would be good for there to be a stakeholder-led process that identified specific categories of funding within that IDEA budget. That would then have to be approved by the Special Education Advisory Panel, and the department would work with the Division of Administration to let competitive processes, rather than just roll over contracts year after year after year, which has been done in the past, in service of those categories. That has all taken place. With respect to the Special Education Advisory Panel specific, what they approve and what they don't, I'm going to ask Jamie. So maybe, Jamie, you can recap that process.
Excuse me just a second, John.
Please.
Could I ask a question, please, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Before Jamie starts, this is not to be confused with, I know that board members have been receiving correspondence regarding gumbo. Jamie, I'd like for you to distinguish between what you've done and then also the gumbo issue, which I don't think people really understand. Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll just try to briefly walk you guys through.
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Jamie Wong with the Department of Education. I know many of you and oversee all the special education policy work here at the department. And I'll walk you through just sort of at the highest level this process that we often refer to as the IDEA budgeting process. And what this is, every year the federal government asks every state to complete an application outlining how, in very broad categories, you will spend the state level set aside, as the superintendent mentioned. On average, it's between $21 and $23 million that is kept at the state level each year. They give us very specific categories in which you must say, here is the amount of money that we will put in these different areas. Over the past 6 to, I guess, probably 8 months at this point, we've been working through our advisory panel to really reframe how we approach this work. We began these conversations with a smaller work group in December. In January, at our advisory panel meeting, walked through a set of priorities that we had identified. In March, came back to the panel and said, within these categories, here's how we will budget that into the actual grant application. That was out for public comment throughout the spring, and that application was officially submitted to the federal government on May 12th. We have not received our formal notice back, although we get indication almost every year that this will continue through the process. The federal government gives us certain dollar figures that must be in all of those categories. We have given our community the ability to provide public feedback on all of this work. We've incorporated that into the final application. To Ms. Visha, your specific questions, we don't go all the way down to the granular level of within each category, this dollar figure here, this dollar figure here. But what we have been discussing with stakeholders is the types of activities that we will commit to, and the alignment of those to certain priorities that we've been vetting through the Special Education Advisory Panel. To this specific issue, I think the one that is before us today, or will be before us likely in August, is around the set of supports for families. And what we have committed is that we will continue to provide services to families. And the way we have outlined, and this was in our March meeting as well, is the department will host, per Ms. Edmondson, your guidance, regional community meetings where we'll do trainings with the various special education communities across the state, provide that guidance and support from being hosted by the department. We'll work with partners to have regional peer-to-peer support for families. That's the competitive RFA process that is out right now. And we'll provide sets of tools and resources for families that are accessible to families across the state and can be used by whoever is identified as a regional partner. That's the second RFA that's out right now for those pieces of support.
What was,
Ms. Evanston?
go ahead.
Can you speak to Gumbo also? Because I know board members, unless they don't have any questions, but there's a very distinguishable difference between the issue with Gumbo and this. Could you speak to that for us, please?
Sure. So as I had mentioned, really the bulk of this work was to identify what are the priorities that our community feels we should be spending this money on. We identified 4 key areas. Making sure that we have a workforce that is prepared to meet the needs of all students with disabilities, ensuring that teachers have tools and resources to support the students in their classroom, that we have specific support for how different disabilities may manifest in the classroom, and that we are focusing on building the systems that support the appropriate, accurate, and early identification of students and the appropriate transition to life after the K-12 system. Those are the big priority areas and activities that go. Then we've identified activities that would fall under each of those categories. As part of that process and as part of this discussion over the past few months, there has not been an identification of a priority for athletic games for students with disabilities, which is a relationship we've had through a subcontract with one of the Families Helping Family Centers to support athletic games for students who have visual and orthopedic impairments. So this is probably what many of you have heard as the Gumbo contract. We've worked with the organization that have that, and we're working with the special school district because we've heard from a lot of families that the individual students who have benefited from this type of activity could still benefit from that. And we're working with the special school district to implement under their direction a program that they would facilitate to ensure that students have that access over the course of the next school year, and working with the team at Gumbo to make that appropriate transition.
Jamie, let me just ask you a couple questions that I have a feeling board members are interested in knowing. Who developed the priority areas? In other words, after we informed board members that we were not going to simply roll over the same contracts year after year as we've been doing for a long time, who is it that created the categories of those areas?
Yeah, so we had we pulled together first in December a working group of a diverse group of stakeholders, special education directors, parents, advocates, just a whole gambit, business managers. We sat down and sort of walked through this process and went to our advisory panel in January and said, here is what we are thinking of priority areas, give us some feedback. We got some feedback on that and then used that to then guide the development of the grant application.
And who approves the grant application before it's sent into the feds?
There's not an official approval process. It's a full stakeholder engagement process, but ultimately it has to be submitted on behalf of the Department of Education.
So, and that is the law, that it's not a BESI responsibility to approve that application, but there are consultation obligations in the law.
Yes.
That it has to go through the Special Education Advisory Panel and so on.
Yes, there is the parameters from the federal government is that it must be posted for public review for 60 days, and you must accept public comment for 30 days.
So the department, working with the stakeholders, exercised some discretion on that basis to say that what we've heard from stakeholders is that games, while clearly important, are not something that should be prioritized in the IDA budget, and that family support activities should be prioritized in the budget. So I think you're hearing two things. You're hearing, one, that family support are not prioritized at a funding level that is high enough, and the department has that discretion, and so we can certainly talk about that. And secondly, I think you're hearing that the department did not submit something to the Fed saying we plan to include games in this year's budget, although we do plan to transition that funding over time and to allow the special school district to continue to support that activity, given how much they work with students with orthopedic disabilities, for example.
Ms. Vilche?
The process you've described, I think, is very good. I mean, it's something that we've been asking for, to take a look at the state set aside and to have the people who are most directly affected in terms of the parents, the stakeholders, the school systems come together and prioritize what those areas are. I'm looking right now, because this was sent out sometime earlier, just from the group for that period of public comment on major categories of the set aside and what was decreased and what was increased. And while I can't speak directly to the agencies that made inquiries, the support and direct services, personnel prep and development and training, that was decreased by 2.2 million, or suggested to be, whereas the support capacity building and improvement of delivery of services was increased more than that. So I'm assuming that those particular agencies fell under, I guess, funding allocation for that first part that was decreased. So I guess what I'm asking, in this competitive process for that particular function, the total amount of money allocated, I'm assuming, was decreased?
Well,
I heard it was decreased from 800,000 to 500,000, so I don't know the total figures per se, but is that somewhat accurate to say that there was a decrease in funding for that particular function?
So I'm not actually sure what you're looking at, but let me try to give you an example, because one of the discussions that we had along the way is, the application is pretty much the same every year from the federal government, at least the categories that they give us. Mm-hmm. The process we've used and where we've directed funds for different activities, sometimes we're not in direct alignment. So I'll give you a concrete example, I think one that's really easy to understand because it's two very straightforward ones. And that is, there are two categories in that grant application that speak to assistive technology. One is really focusing on the component of individual assistive technology to students and assessing their needs for devices and things of that nature. And another is focused on really building the classroom capacity and integrating technology and making the overall instruction more accessible to students with disabilities. Historically, we have always put our budgeted amount of money in one section. And as part of our discussions in the work group, people said in all of these categories, we should really look at the function of the activity and where it fits in the category. So in this year's application, you see it broken out in two places, and that's reflective in a lot of the other categories. So it's not really a fair comparison to say this category is increased, this one is decreased. We really have to break it down and look at the types of activities that we're still trying to carry out or new activities carrying out as part of it.
So the process that you've described, I'm totally in favor of, in terms of getting that stakeholder group together, bringing it before the Special Education Advisory Panel, and I would hope that all along the way these different people have had their input and, y'all have come to this conclusion. I was looking at what y'all put out for public comment in terms of the major categories. So I'm fine with the process. I think it's a good process.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Boucher, but I want to kind of head this off. Members, I appreciate that the question was asked. It's something we've gotten some emails on. But as has been identified pretty early on, this is not germane to today's topics and what we're covering in this meeting today. So recognize there will be opportunities in the next meeting in August to address this more closely. In the meantime, I would encourage you to get more information from BESI staff, LDOE, from the councils. But because we have not advertised it for today, we're getting too far afield now. Other people who have comments on this were not here today. They can be here in August. So I thank you for the information, for the questions, but we need to move on back to more relevant matters at this point.
Can I ask what's going to be covered at the next meeting on this issue?
Yes.
I believe it is the result of the procurement processes related to the categories. So in other words, there were categories identified throughout this very lengthy process. In service of those categories, there were specific competitive procurements that were put out. Why will that be new? You always approve the contracts under the IDA budget. It's just that in my time, and I certainly believe in my predecessor's time, and maybe even in his predecessor's time, most of those contracts were just rolled over year over year over year with no competitive process. You're now considering the result of competitive procurements. However, I understand that what some of the emails have generated is that people don't think that the amount of money that is entailed in those contracts is large enough. And given that that's an administrative issue, not a BESI issue, I and Jamie will be happy to sit down with any BESI member interested in discussing any administrative issue like that, the amount of money in those contracts, for your input.
And you'd
Thank you
be
all.
sitting down between now and August with BESI members to talk about that?
I'd be happy to sit down
before the
between
August
now
meeting.
and tomorrow with any BESI member.
Okay.
Thank you all. Let's move on to our next item, please.
Thank you, James. James.
On page 42, item 4.1, consideration of a discussion of the MFP formula. The recommendation is to receive the 70% instructional requirement report.
Can I get a motion to receive?
So moved.
Ms. Bochet, seconded by Dr. Bophy. Any questions? With no questions, do we have any objections? With no objections, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 51, item 5.1, consideration of fiscal dialogues as a result of the fiscal risk assessment processes. The recommendation is to approve.
Dr. Bophy, need a second?
A second.
Ms. Holloway, any questions? Any comments from the board? Any objections to the motion? Hearing no objections, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 67, item 5.2, consideration of a report from Education Finance staff concerning types 2 and 3B charter school budgets and expenditure reports, including irregularities or concerns. The recommendation is to receive.
Need a motion, please? Dr. Bophy, need a second? Dr. Jones, any questions from the board? Any comments? Any objections? Hearing no objections, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 72, item 5.3, consideration of LDE contracts over $50,000. The recommendation is to approve. Revisions were made to the exec rec and backup on April 16th and April 19th, and a handout reflecting those updates has been distributed.
I need a motion to approve, please, members. Ms. Holloway, second by Dr. Bophy. Do I have any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I might just provide a brief summary of the contracts. There is an auditing contract with Postal Wait in Netterville, which provides a number of services related to accounting and auditing for the state. That is a child care funding issue. There is a communications contract for $100,000 funded by federal monies and state HG funds. This is in response to our education preparation providers' longstanding request that we be doing more as a state to marketing the educator profession. And so we have commenced that process through this competitive procurement for this contract, which will take place over the course of the next year. Third, using the TIF funds, primarily the teacher incentive funds, the state has sought private services for the training of mentor educators. These educators will provide oversight of the residents through educator preparation programs and also will serve as content experts in their particular subject areas. Two entities responded and won in what was a very competitive procurement. One of them is an organization named SchoolKit. The other is an organization named the Dana Center, which is a prestigious math entity at the University of Texas. Also are amendments to two contracts so as to include for the first time practice tests in these areas. These are science and social studies practice tests. They were not included in the original funding of these two West Ed contracts, and so those contracts are being amended so that we can provide teachers with science tests. And finally, there is a translation contract for a vendor in what language. We have had contracts with this vendor before. This will provide translation services for a very, very wide variety of documents that will include handbooks and guides, assessment guides, letters, and other services for written language that the state puts out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Do I have any comments from the board at this time? Ms. Bochet.
I just have a question with when we talked about the science and social studies practice tests. In the realm of social studies, has there been any progress on identifying any Tier 1 materials for social studies?
I actually don't know if we have staff to answer that question. I know that to your point, this has been an issue of serious concern, and I don't know if our staff are here right now to answer that question. We have not posted any, but whether there's good progress in motion, I don't know. And I'll have Rebecca and her staff follow up with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
If they would just let me
Yeah,
know by tomorrow, is no problem.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to be
Just make sure
on the
that-
agenda per se, but
Yeah.
it is a serious concern for most school systems in trying to secure materials which would be reflective of how our children will be assessed.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have some comment cards, public comment cards. I have 4 names here who do not wish to speak. I'm saying for information only, it looks like Ms. Sharday Johnson, Jeff Arsenault, Ashlyn Artis, and Mike Holmgrist, I believe. Wishing to speak, Sean Fleming, Pam Carey, Karen Artis, April Dunn, and if Annie Comer and Melissa Brose would go ahead and come down to the front and get ready. For those speaking, I remind you of timelines, but also please let's keep it relevant to the times we have. We had a lengthy discussion a little bit ago about what's on the agenda today, what's not. So I just appreciate some respect on covering the items that are relevant for today, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Sean Fleming. I work for the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council. While I appreciate y'all thinking the Families contracts is not germane, the issue that is germane is the lack of information that people have related to the IDA budget. On November 28th, Ms. Voiche, Ms. Edmiston, Ms. Holloway, y'all provided me the opportunity to meet with y'all and Superintendent White and Jamie Wong. Because of the lack of information over time, that we cannot see what's happening in the IDA budget. This has happened again. You know, immediately following that meeting, they did provide one data point on teacher residencies, the amount of money from the IDA budget. But what's happening right now is the lack of ability for stakeholder input because of the lack of transparency in how the funds are being, the discretion, as it was stated, that the department is using to make funding, and there was a funding shift. So the fact that it's not on the agenda this time, there is money that is or should be on the agenda. Perhaps it should have been in item 2.2, because the IDEA is a federal grant. It runs through a federal cycle. It runs from October 1st to September 30th every year. And in this federal grant period, and I would rephrase it from not just Families and Families, it's family and community supports that the commitment of this department and this board has to educate families and provide the supports they need. Y'all have been spending $800,000, $80,500 per center for a long time, and y'all have been doing that in collaboration with other agencies. I agree, and I think it was a good process to look at priorities and all that. I think it's a timing issue, because at our council meeting in April, it became apparent that the department was not aware that the funding cycle of the contracts was on a state cycle and ended on June 30th. And so they put a Band-Aid approach of $12,500 for this next quarter, July, August, and September, which is essentially a cut in the IDA funds. So I still have a question of what are they doing with the rest of the money? Because that was a previous IDEA grant application, and I don't have any information, and the decision's already been made. If we wait till August to ask you, we're in a strange predicament, because the RFA went out, as Ms. Voiche, you brought up, without any vetting. Instead of y'all and the entire community saying we agree with pushing this out and agreeing with what the goals and terms and amounts are, we're only left with, after the decision to cut, which it will be cut starting July 1st, services to families will be reduced. Families and family centers will reduce staff and the capacity to serve people. Their catchment areas, the regions they serve, will shift come October 1st, which will further strain their resources. Families will get a lot less support, and the requirements to contact half the kids with disabilities in their area will reduce the amount of support that's provided to people who need a lot of support. And these are things, all these particulars, first the amount, a 37% reduction, a $300,000 per year reduction to support families, the change in the catchment area, the change in the focus and what they're doing was not vetted at all. The fact that this information in the IDA budget, and y'all are considering IDA budget, I don't want to put a core to say I'm against anything y'all are agreeing to, because it's difficult to say, well, you should prioritize this over that, when all we have the opportunity to do is see it piecemeal over time. But what's going to happen in August is it will be too late. The discretion is not from the community, it's not being vetted, it's not your purview. The RFA was out. It will be impossible for the department to then say, well, we'll up you to $80,000 after the families and family centers and whoever else, and truthfully, it's not enough money for anybody else to apply, just to be fair, to say we're going to give you $80,000 to do what you told us you would do for $50,000. And so I want to ask of you two things. First off, that you direct the department to bring the families and families up to their full amount for this coming quarter, instead of the $12,500 for July, August, and September, that they fund them for $20,000, because they're essentially cutting them without, there's no way to comment on the cut at this juncture, because technically it's not on the agenda because it wasn't in item 2.2. And I want to ask that y'all withdraw the RFA until it is fully vetted, not only the amounts but the conditions within that RFA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fleming. You're almost relevant on some of that, I think. Yes, please identify yourself.
My name is Pam Carey, and I'm a retired adaptive English teacher, and I've been employed for Families Helping Families at the Crossroads for 24 years as a Gumbo coordinator. So I'm not here today to talk to you about Gumbo. I'm here to talk to you about the Families Helping Families agencies across the state that serve one-on-one, face-to-face to families. They also attend the school meetings with these families to ensure that their children get the modifications and show that they're know what their child's rights are. The way that the new RFA is written makes it difficult, if not impossible, to fulfill the requirements that are prescribed. Our children's families need the personal touch that Families Helping Families can give them, so that their children with more severe disabilities will not fall through the cracks, and that they will not be forced to attend institutional type schools just to get their education.
Thank you, Ms. Carey. And again, I remind you all, please try to keep it relevant. These are not issues that are in front of us in the contract for this section right now. Yes, ma'am. Please identify yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is April Dunn. I'm the Vice Chair of Louisiana Developmental Disabilities. My comment is to you, please don't wait till August to vote on this, because this is very crucial for Families Helping Families. I would urge you to put this on the agenda for the next cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next.
Good morning. I'm Karen Ortis. I'm from St. Tammany Parish, and I'd like to read Ashley Nelson's testimony for you. She could not make it here today. She is a parent of a child with a disability, and she is also inclusive education specialist for North Shore Families Helping Families. As a parent of a child with an IEP, I'm deeply concerned about the Department of Education changing regional lines served by Families Helping Family centers. Parents, especially those with children with disabilities, are constantly trying to juggle multiple providers. Changing regional lines will confuse and overwhelm parents who are trying to navigate an already complicated system. I am concerned that these changes demonstrate the Department of Education's unwillingness to work collaboratively with other agencies and a disregard for parents' needs for streamlining resources. Additionally, requiring different departments within the same organization to serve geographically different populations will create ineffectively within the organizations by forcing centers to duplicate work done by other centers and to ensure that patients have access to all available supports and services. Given the cuts to center funding, any inefficiency with a program will further restrict the center's ability to provide quality services. I am also concerned the Department of Education will require contract recipients to maintain contact with 50% of all students with disabilities. First, the department has failed to clarify if those are only students with exceptionalities other than giftedness, or if gifted students will be included. They have also not clarified if students with disabilities will have individual accommodation plans, if those will be included. Second, and more important, this requirement says to me that the Louisiana Department of Education does not trust local education agencies to inform parents of their rights or to provide a free and appropriate public education, even to those students who have relatively uncomplicated needs. While I agree that all families of students with disabilities, regardless of the level of need, should be made aware of services provided by Families Helping Families or any other provider of family support, the removal of already limited resources from parents of students with significant educational needs, to focus on identifying, locating, and maintaining contact with families who do not need or want services in order to fulfill a quota is wrong. I am so deeply concerned that the department expects these supports to be provided to families across the state with approximately $305,000 less per year. I ask that you question the LDE regarding the necessity of all this change. I ask that you not approve or support these changes through the RFA when the opportunity comes before you as you consider stakeholder input. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Members, I'll remind you that, again, this testimony is not on any of the 7 items that we have in front of us on this motion, but I've let this many speak, so we have 2 more. If you want to defer, if you're on the same topic, I'd appreciate it, but if you want to go ahead and speak, please go ahead. Identify yourself for the camera. I mean, for the microphone. Make sure your microphone's on, ma'am. Green light, and start over, please.
I'm Melissa Brostad. I'm coming to you as a parent and an employee of Families Helping Families Crossroads. As a parent, I've had the privilege of watching my son with spina bifida graduate from high school and then go on to college and graduate with a double bachelor's from Louisiana College. Although I've been an employee of Region 6 Families Helping Families office for the past 22 years, I was still in the need of an advocate. Although I know that the laws, I was still I would get emotional and still need that advocate there by my side because sometimes I was just too close to the issues to realize he wasn't getting what he deserved and had a right to. Without the advocate's help, I do not believe my son would be where he is today. He now works and has graduated from a college and works at a large automotive company as the chief complaint investigator. I will now speak to you on behalf of an employee of Families Helping Families. I started working there 22 years ago. I've been an advocate for parents like myself, not only someone that needs to make sure things are done in a timely manner, but for parents who have had to file complaints with the State Department to get what their children have a right to. And I've also been through the due process with many parents in our region. It is obvious that the direction being led at this present time by LDOE is going away from serving families with severe disabilities. To think that using web-based resources and telephone calls would serve these families is just unthinkable. I would have to say that approximately 75% of the families we serve in Region 6 either do not have the resources to use web-based resources or are unable to adequately understand these resources. This is one of the many reasons why Families Helping Families exist today. We pride ourselves in being a one-stop hub for families with all disabilities. For years, FHF and Families Helping and LDOE have collaborated with other agencies in supporting FHF centers. LDOE funds Families Helping Family Centers with ideal funds to provide parents with information, support, and training. This year, LDOE has proposed several changes, cuts from our budgets from $80,500 to $50,000 per year, changes to the parish that we each serve, and put our contracts into a competitive RFA with mostly impossible goals. Changes to the parishes we are serving will cause us to duplicate work, double coverages by many of our centers. It also stretches our staff and resources to cover more parishes overall. All of this in less money. So I'm now asking that you relook at these RFAs. And the other thing I want to bring, some of the data that the RFA asked us to go and look at is not usable because it's marked as NA on the Louisiana State Performance Plan. So we cannot look at that data and use that for the RFA. So that needs to be looked at also. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, ma'am. Make sure the green light's on and then identify yourself.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Annie Comer, and I'm from Tangipahoa Parish. And while I appreciate your concern to stay on the agenda, many of us drove for an hour to get here or more. And we took care to get respite care sitters to watch our children and made certain arrangements to make sure that we could make it here today because we were informed that this was an important meeting for us to be at. And we made arrangements to be here. So I appreciate that you're trying to be on the agenda, but if we made such careful arrangements to be here, you should appreciate that fact and not be so hasty to get us out of our seats and give us our time to speak.
Ms. Comer, I want to be very clear with you. I could have stopped every one of you from speaking. It's not germane. I've allowed that because I recognize the
Well, I
sacrifice you've made to be
appreciate
here.
that. I
Thank you.
appreciate that. But we're here out of passion for our children
Yes, ma'am.
who have special needs. I have 3 sons with autism, and without North Shore Families Helping Families, I would have been lost during their IEPs. My twins have autism. One has severe behavioral issues. And without North Shore Families Helping Families and their advocates helping me through the IEP process, I would have been absolutely lost. I would have had horrible problems, and they were able to assist me and let me know my rights and what I could and could not do. They helped me remain focused during the IEPs and not get so emotional during the IEPs, which are very draining, especially when you have 2 going through that process at the same time. And one is having behavioral issues, and you have people coming at you at all different times. And North Shore Families Helping Families are able to assist you with that and tell you where the school is doing things that you feel that you're being attacked for. When you're not being attacked, they're just trying to get your child what your child needs, but you feel that they're attacking you. And North Shore Families Helping Families is able to say, no, this is actually how it's supposed to go. And without them having the needs, the funding that they need, you don't know that. And parents don't know. The school doesn't have the resources to come in and say what they're supposed to do because they're already taxed. So they need North Shore Families Helping Families to come in and help the parents because they don't have a liaison there. So they need North Shore Families Helping Families. I did want to make a point about Gumbo. Gumbo sounds like a great program that Jamie Wong was speaking about, but you have to think about where the advocates and the parents come from. I do know that we had 4 people apply from Partners in Policymaking for SEEP, and none of those parents were chosen. So you have to think about who these advocates are that are being chosen for these programs and who is choosing those advocates and why they're being chosen for these different programs.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Members, I'm sorry. I'd like to keep it relevant to the 7 contracts we have. We're going to be discussing this again next month. Please
So
keep that
my
in
question,
mind.
I'll ask the question and then you can decide if
Okay.
you have or answer it or not. So it was communicated to individuals that they should be here today, but on the agenda, that was not the case. And so my question is, where did that communication come from?
Yeah, could you answer
The
that? Were you
communication
directed by
came
someone in
from,
particular?
LACAN,
Can you be more specific?
and an action alert from LACAN.
And is that part of Families Helping Families?
No, it's LACAN. Are you familiar with LACAN?
I have heard of it before and I get materials, but I'm trying to track it down to the source.
It's Sean?
I think that should maybe answer your question, Dr. Bophy.
It's
Lock
the
in action
council,
alert.
Sean, is that right? Okay, that's helpful.
Okay. So again, members, you've heard public testimony, but about items that we have at the next meeting. So I would appreciate, Ms. Fauché.
I'll be brief, I promise. But I do feel like I need to make a comment.
Okay.
I'm not sure when it would have been appropriate for people to come to discuss this, because I do agree, if we look at August, we will be looking at contracts that are already being recommended to us. So I think there's a little disconnect there. I think the appropriate place would have been and should be, and hopefully if the process is in a place, we can refine it a little bit. And I know Ms. Holloway and Stebbins have worked very, very hard with this, that at these SEEP meetings, that these set-aside amounts are put, and Ms. Wong as well, hopefully that we made the suggestion that it is put with these are the total amounts allocated for these specific purposes in the set-aside, and as allocations are made within those and/or grants, that's put at each meeting and subtracted out. Therefore, we shouldn't have this kind of a situation going forward. The second issue, and I appreciate Superintendent White offered to speak with us after this particular meeting, is I do see an issue with the last quarter of funding, which is outside of our school fiscal year, but inside the federal fiscal year, if there's a drop in that funding for that 3-month period, and you're looking at $20,000 to $12,500, per center is 7,500 times 10 centers. Maybe we could look to see how we could make some people whole, but that would be a discussion we could have for that last quarter prior to those RFAs. So I appreciate your willingness to talk about that.
Of course. And if I may, just to, so you know, and so the board knows, Ms. Edmonston, Ms. Wong, and I met with all of the leaders of the Family Helping Families Centers, and they asked for bridge funding, and we responded with $12,500 for that quarter, which is a quarter of the annual amount. I understand that it was voiced people would like $7,000 more dollars than that. Something we can certainly discuss.
Talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Board members, Ms. Holloway?
Yes, I'd like to make some statements in regards to the Special Ed Advisory Panel. As chairman of the panel, our members have worked diligently and very hard in service and understanding the processes of IDA, et cetera, and truly welcome our public, as well as you, Sean, and people that do come to make statements. But just to clarify that in January and in March, we did have this on the agenda, and there was a discussion and also open for public comments. And besides that, as Superintendent White indicated that, Kathy, thank you so much for working with us and also meeting with families, helping families, along with Jamie and Superintendent White, to move forward with the goals and what our future holds for our families. But hopefully when Superintendent White meets with the board members, there could be a better explanation about our funding. I don't know if there is much of a cut with Families Helping Families, but in setting goals, priorities, and accountability for our agencies. And that's what we're discussing here in moving forward, that we can have set priorities with our agencies. And also explaining the cut with the conference cut of, say, possibly $15,000 from Helping Families, and the DOE taking part in ownership of this. So I think there are some things that need to be clarified with our board members with moving forward with Helping Families, and we definitely want our families supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, is there anything else or any particular questions? If not, we'll go ahead and take a vote on this matter. Any objections to the motion as it stands for us? Hearing no objections, the motion carries. Next item of business, please.
On page 85, item 5.4, consideration of federal, state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, Type 5 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations, competitive and other. Recommendation is to approve.
Mr. Garvey, I need a second, please. Ms. Evanston, moved and seconded. Any comments, questions from the board? Ms. Evanston?
I'm not going to be able to second to recuse.
At the recuse? Okay, so I have a motion. I still need a second then. Ms. Holloway, a second? She's recused. Let's narrow this down. All right, I have a motion from Mr. Garvey, a second by Dr. Bophy. And I have a recusal from Ms. Holloway, Ms. Evanston, Ms. Vaucher. All right, we're on the same page now. Any questions or comments? Any objections, noting the recusals? Hearing no objections, motion to carry. Next item, please.
On page 122, item 6.1, consideration of a report from Education Finance staff concerning Type 5 charter school budgets and expenditure reports, including irregularities or concerns. Recommendation is to receive.
A motion to receive this report. Dr. Bophy, I need a second, please. Second. Dr. Thomason? I have a motion and a second. Do I have any discussion? No discussion and no comment cards. Any objection? No objection. Motion carries. Next item, please.
Item 6.2, page 130, consideration of RSD contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. Recommendation is to approve.
Do I have a motion to approve? Dr. Jones, I need a second. Second. Dr. Bophy, any discussion? Superintendent, do you have something you want to add?
Members, these are New Orleans-based capital project contracts and amendments to contracts.
With that noted, any discussion? With no discussion, do I have any objection? And with no objection, motion carries. Next item, please.
Page 143, item 6.3, consideration of a review of the 2017-2018 budget for the Recovery School District. Recommendation is to receive, and the exec rec and backup were revised on April 19th, and a handout reflecting those changes has been distributed.
Ms. Fauché moves. Dr. Jones seconds. Superintendent?
Thank you, members. I'm happy to answer any questions on this item. I do want to just, also Superintendent and Assistant Superintendent Narachania can answer questions also. I do want to just make you aware that obviously this is probably the last year in which there will be an operating budget of consequence in the Recovery School District, at least for the foreseeable future. There will be a capital budget. I do want to be clear with you about that. There will continue to be a rather large capital budget for at least the next 2 years as the post-Katrina capital projects in Orleans Parish get completed. This year, and we can update you on this as time goes forward, there will be fewer schools in the RSD in New Orleans because a handful of schools will be voluntarily returning to governance under the Orleans Parish School Board. That takes the operating budget down, but the RSD is still receiving funds and sharing with from Harrah's, the casino in downtown New Orleans, which shares funds between the Orleans Parish School Board and the RSD. Also, the RSD will still be receiving MFP. And so we're kind of in the middle of the process of moving functions effectively from the state to the local district. That includes enrollment, for example, expulsion, for example, technology and human resource and other services will be moving as well. So this is a transitional budget, basically, between now and the time when the schools fully return. I'm happy to answer questions.
Ms. Evanston?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Superintendent White, can you talk a little bit to RSD and Baton Rouge, because we're moving away kind of from New Orleans, but I know that we have someone in charge in Baton Rouge. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The Recovery School District itself oversees the following facilities in East Baton Rouge Parish: Kenilworth, which I believe is in your district, and then I believe the rest, Ms. Edmondson, are not. Capitol High School, Prescott Middle School, Glen Oaks Middle School, Crestworth Middle School, and Dalton Elementary and Lanier Elementary. Those 7 facilities, is that right? 7 facilities are the ones that the RSD oversees. Those schools collaborate with some EBR schools and some other state-authorized schools. And so some of the ones you've considered collegiate, for example, in recent years have been authorized by the state, but they're not housed in a Recovery School District facility. Those are Type 2 charter schools, independent. Dana Peterson is doing all of the states representing for both sets of schools in what is predominantly North Baton Rouge.
Thank you. Mr. Garvey, you had a question?
Yes. I was looking at the page 144, budgeted expenses by line item, and something that looks out of line to me, probably because I just don't know enough about it, is the professional services at $36 million. Can you tell me what that is being spent on?
Those are construction projects, interagency transfer from GOSEP. If it's under interagency transfer, that means that it is a FEMA-funded, predominantly FEMA-funded from GOSEP line.
Okay, thank you.
Members, do we have any other questions relative to this? With no other questions, do I have any objections to the motion? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 151, item 7.1, consideration of legislative reports. Recommendation is to approve.
Dr. Brophy moves. Dr. Jones seconds. Do we have a report? We're receiving, approving. So any questions from the board?
Yeah, I have
Mr.
a
Garvey?
question. This covers page 157, if I understand it right. On page 157, there's a graph that shows dropout rates. And it doesn't seem to show dropout rates going down, but yet our graduation rates, if I understand it right, have been going up. Those two ideas don't fit. Am I seeing this wrong? Is there something else that I'm missing?
I believe so, because this analysis, which is spelled out in the law, which is kind of an awkward thing, does not reflect the fact that each one of these bars is not equal. So in other words, there's a different number of available students at each one of these levels. Therefore, in total, even though each of these is effectively its own separate calculation, in total, the dropout rate actually has gone down quite significantly. Now, just to talk about how the grad rate is calculated and why it's different from this, the grad rate and the dropout rate, you start with 100%. Any student who does not graduate in 4 years, obviously they didn't drop. Any student who graduated within 4 years, they didn't drop out. But also students who continue on in school, they didn't drop out either. So kids who take maybe a 5th year or a 6th year, those kids are still in school. They may be 19, they may be 20, but they're not dropouts. That number actually we're seeing more and more of. We're seeing more 5th and 6th year grads. Therefore, our dropout rate has gone down. The graduation rate within 4 years has also gone up, and of course that's helped the dropout rate go down. But I think the reason that you're describing, Mr. Garvey, here is that, in fact, these numbers are not all created equal.
Well, this isn't total number of dropouts. These are at which grade did they drop out.
Right.
So
right.
Each independent year, you could have a significantly fewer number of dropouts, but these lines encompass all the dropouts for that year and in which grades they did.
Correct.
So at that point, we need to look at where kids are dropping out. Is it the, 12th grade, 11th, 10th, 9th, and so
In other words,
on.
this is, you put it much better than I. This is not an analysis of how many dropouts there are. This is analysis of how many of the dropouts did so in different grade levels.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Jones, you had a question?
Yeah, more of a, I think, clarification. If you look at the scale on the left side, the vertical scale, this is independent of the number of people in the class. It is only reflective of the percentage of the people in the class. So if you have a small number, then a change of 1 or 2 people makes a much greater impact than if you have a number of 2,000, then a change of 1 or 2 makes much less sense. So what you're really looking at when you look at that chart is only the percentage by year of whatever the number was in that class for that particular year.
I think what you can see from looking at this, in earlier years, like that top line represents 9th graders. So we had a greater percentage of 9th graders dropping out, say in 2009, 10, 11, and that percent is coming down slightly, whereas the 10th grade, which is the line right below it, is rising a little. So maybe we're keeping them in at 9th, and the sophomore slump is where we're beginning to lose more percentage-wise. To me, this would be an indicator statewide of what do we need to do and which areas we need to focus on. Where are dropouts continuing to increase percentage-wise? Is it in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade? Is it above that? And those are the kinds of conclusions inferences maybe that we should be drawing from this particular graph.
Dr. Jones?
And one last thing, Mr. Garvey, when we look at whether or not it's up or down or whatever, they use a technique called regression to the means that looks at that. And if you do a regression to the means of that line, for example, that top line on there, you see that it is going like this. And that's how you can make the statement that it's going down. Individual 1 year, one way or the other doesn't necessarily reflect a change to the trend itself.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Bophy?
Do we have any idea why it's increasing in 10th?
It's not increasing in 10th. It's the share of the overall number of dropouts is increasing in 10th.
So why is the share?
I don't know. I think there's probably maybe a couple of reasons for it. One, potentially the shift toward a transitional 9th grade has meant that students effectively have 2 years to accrue a full 9th grade's worth of credits. That's one. Secondly, there may be some change in the data system, or just the way that we're categorizing kids from grade level to grade level. But I think the most pronounced thing is if you look at where this is, the time when the 9th grade number started coming down and the 10th grade number started going up was around the time when the state began counting the graduation rate in the SPS of the way that it scored schools, much more dramatically than past. And that corresponds with an uptick that year, the 2011 year, in the graduation rate pretty significantly. My sense is that if that's true, that probably, potentially it corresponded with just schools creating systems around both credit recovery, around ninth grade academies and other policies that were keeping ninth graders paying
I
more
think
attention
that's
to ninth
more
graders.
of the issue, Superintendent, because what has been happening with the research, we all saw that the kids tended to drop out more in the ninth grade. And if you could keep them in there, you had a better chance of graduation. So ninth grade academies began popping up at that time. School systems put lots of emphasis into supports for ninth graders, even sometimes isolating the ninth grade academy pretty much from the rest of the high school. And then what happened is, I think what we're beginning to see is then those supports may not be as much in place as they move to that 10th grade year. That's what I'm finding within my district. I'm assuming those are the same types of things that are occurring across the state. So now we're making an effort, which group of students needs those continued supports more heavily, and how do we shift some of those resources then to that second year to begin to keep them. So we are, and I think most people are, seeing a greater percentage of their dropouts move now from the 9th to the 10th grade because of those supports and because of the 9th grade academies.
Thank you, Ms. Voce. That's good insight. Anybody else on the board? Ms. Amundson, did you have
I just want to say that I totally agree with what Ms. Voce is saying, and so hopefully, Superintendent, we can kind of target that for future, to look at those supports being carried on. The 9th grade academies are great, but then when you get out of there, you're really almost on your own.
Thank you. Any other comments on the board? With no other comments, any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 164, item 8.1, consideration of revisions to the Louisiana Administrative Code, Title 28, Part 1, Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent.
Can I get a motion to approve? Ms. Holloway, second by Dr. Bofi. Any comments from the board? Questions from the board? No comments, no questions. Do I have any objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Next item, please.
That concludes your agenda.
Thank you. Adjourn.